right. Well, great. Thanks for the intro, Kevin. And hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and sharing in this adventure with me. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to speak for SKABC again. I did an in-person talk, gosh, 2017, maybe 2018, about my first through paddle of the Inside Passage. Tonight's a whole different story about my my recent journey. So with that, I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. All right. So essentially, I've created a 50-minute version of my 78-day experience of kayaking the Inside Passage. So let's just dive right in here. I planned this as a solo expedition, but sometimes I wonder if I shouldn't change the title of my talk to How to Fit 80 People in a Kayak. All kidding aside, though, it was indeed a solo adventure. And my solo experience was made even more meaningful by the community that I found along the way. I mean, every encounter was a gift, and every encounter had a lesson to teach me. Everything was just like connected and meaningful. And that is exactly what synchronicity is. These things, events in our lives that might seem connected or meaningful, but they're actually all tied together. And in order for anything to be synchronistic in our lives, well, first we have to be open to it, right? And we have to have something inside us that stirs us up and inspires us and tells us that whatever opportunity is being put in our path, we're meant to step into it. So here is some synchronicity that I stepped into on my recent journey. So some pretty magical things can happen when you run into quirky people in the strangest of places. So the Inside Passage is it's an extraordinary coastal route that pulses its way up the western edge of North America. And it's a place that has stirred something up inside me for a long time. And in a sense, it's influenced the direction of my life. And a question I'm often asked is, why? Like, why these long journeys, and specifically, why the Inside Passage? And for me, first and foremost, is always the spirit of adventure. And I think so many of you can relate to that. I think that's the big draw of this incredible sport that we enjoy, sea kayaking so much, is that sense of adventure, whether you're going out for 2 hours or 2 weeks or 2 months. It's also very therapeutic for me. I think we can all occasionally use a big fat dose of aquatherapy. And there's a little bit of that because it's their sort of reasoning going on. And ultimately, I guess I wanted to see if I still had it in me. 2010, I did my first through paddle of the Inside Passage, kayaking from Anacortes to Juneau. And then 12 years later, hopefully 12 years wiser, definitely 12 years slower, I set off on another long, slow paddle in a long, skinny boat. And, that day-to-day rhythm of traveling through a marine environment and exploring purely for my own astonishment, it just gives me a sense of connectedness, like nothing else, as well as this ever startling awareness that this planet that we call home is so precious. And I honestly cannot remember a time where I have felt more alive, more content, more balanced than I do when I'm on these long trips. And gosh, they've taught me so many lessons along the way, but I struggle to this day with how to apply those lessons, those epiphanies and life transformations to my everyday life. So I guess that is a work in progress. Why do I go off on these remote wilderness paddles by myself? Solitude. It's always been at the heart of my journeys. I just absolutely love the heightened awareness and the sense of empowerment that comes from being 100% reliable on my own skills and abilities. And, with that comes this intense sense of freedom. Is it more dangerous? I think that really depends on a few things. Your skill set, of course, your comfort level, and your approach. And I have always loved the approach that this woman took. My hero, my inspiration, the late, great grande dame of expedition paddling, Audrey Sutherland, whose mission statement was always to go simple, go solo, and go now. And Audrey had kayaked tens of thousands of miles, almost always solo, always in an inflatable kayak. And she did this in her 60s, 70s, and well into her 80s. So think about that. You've got this petite, gray-haired lady, 120 pounds soaking wet, going off on these rigorous expeditions by herself year after year after year until she was almost 90 years old. So she has redefined for me what it means to grow old. And I've been working on a book about Audrey Sutherland. And part of my goal with this book is to portray her not only as the woman that she was, but as the legend she is. And part of my research has entailed retracing the route that she details in her third and last book, Paddling North, which tells the story of her earlier solo expeditions in Southeast Alaska in the early 80s. So on my recent journey, while literally following in her paddle strokes, I pitched my tent in some of the same exact places where she did. I laid my head on some of the same wilderness cabin bunks that she did. I even recreated some of the camp recipes that she shares in her book. And ultimately, I just felt the essence of Audrey along the way. And somehow this is all going to be woven into that story. So that's another work in progress. So the Inside Passage has given me so much over the years, and I wanted to give back. And I knew that the Canadian portion of the Inside Passage goes through an area known as the Great Bear Rainforest, which is the largest intact temperate rainforest on Earth, reaching from the northern end of Vancouver Island all the way to the Alaskan border. And it's a globally important ecosystem that is under consistent threat. So this is the area that I chose to focus on to give back. And I reached out to a Canadian nonprofit conservation organization called Pacific Wild. I've been following their work and supporting them for years. And we had a conversation about my vision, my desire to give back. And this short video will give you just a tiny, tiny glimpse into what our collaboration looked like.
I'm Susan Conrad, and I guess I didn't coin the phrase, but I am an adventurepreneur. I'm kind of using this expedition as a platform of sorts to raise awareness for the Great Bear Rainforest and all the pivotal work that Pacific Wild does. You only conserve what you love, and you only love what you understand. So I'm hoping that by raising awareness with my paddle, that people will be inspired and motivated and want to advocate for it and protect it.
So that awareness was raised in part by a really cool thing that Pacific Wild created. They launched this online interactive story map that brought my journey to life while it was underway. So this was a website where people could follow me on my journey and learn about these fragile marine ecosystems that I was paddling through. And they also learned how they too could give back. We ended up raising over $40,000, all of which was funneled back into these marine protection campaigns. So this was really super cool thing for me. I just felt like I was indeed giving back. And if you want to take a deeper dive into this story map and this specific component of my expedition, you can go to my website, susanmarieconrad.com, and the link to the story map is right there on the homepage. So switching gears for a few minutes, I wanted to give you all a real brief overview of how I prepared for this trip. So let's start with the big picture. I took my first strokes on the west side of San Juan Island, a place called Roach Harbor. And I finished on the west side of Baranof Island, Sitka, Alaska. It took me 78 days. It was 1,046 nautical miles, which comes out to just a hair over 1,200 statute or land miles. And for all my Canadian friends, that's 1,938 kilometers. So to wrap my brain around the whole logistical resupply issue, I ended up breaking my route down into 7 sections that were structured around my 6 resupply ports of call. So these were towns that I would paddle into to retrieve my supplies that were mailed ahead to those towns. And I'll talk more about each of those 7 legs in just a little bit. A big part of the pre-trip logistics was plotting and planning all of the charts. I like to do it the old-fashioned way. I had 34 or 35 paper charts and spent a fair bit of time calculating distances and annotating them with potential campsites, points of interest, all of my crux moves, things like that. And Audrey's book, Paddling North, that you see open on the right side, that was my Bible for annotating the Alaskan portion of the charts, and it was my constant companion when I was underway for the Alaskan sections. I used a Garmin InReach satellite tracking device. I know many of you are familiar with the InReach or the Spot or similar electronics. The device would give out my waypoints every 10 minutes or so. So the little dots that you're seeing on the screen is the InReach giving my location in real time as I'm working my way through the route. So this was really a cool feature, especially for my friends and family back home, because they could log on and see where I was at any given time. And they ended up being sort of like a remote support crew for me, which gave me kind of a warm, fuzzy feeling, especially on those dark, cold, dank days, and gave me yet another reason to climb out of the tent and keep this journey going day after day after day. Food was another huge component for me. I I think all paddlers like to eat well, and I know I certainly do. I'm a big fan of dehydrating all of my own food, or most of my food. Did a lot of one-pot meals, my favorite soups and stews and chili recipes, as well as fruits and vegetables, different types of sauces and pastes that I would add to a variety of packaged or processed meals, all of my carbohydrates, rice, potatoes, pasta, that sort of thing. And when I dehydrated all of these items, once they cooled, I would immediately put them into airtight glass jars, and then they would eventually be assembled into individual meals and then placed into resupply boxes. There's my resupply boxes right there. They're fairly organized at this point. This is just a couple weeks before I'm scheduled to leave. I've got the mailing labels all printed out and attached to them. All I need to do at this point is to integrate all the charts that you see on the table there. Now they're all, I've copied them onto paper, laminated them, and they're all sorted and organized. I just need to slip them into the correct boxes. So for the boxes that were going to Canadian ports, there were 4 of them. Since I live fairly close to the Canadian border in Washington State, I physically drove those across the border and mailed them on the other side from Canada Post, I think in White Rock. And I did that so that there was no issue of them getting caught up in customs. I wanted my boxes there when I paddled into these towns, and they always were. The boxes that were going to Alaskan ports, my partner was responsible for mailing those at specific times. Okay, so now we're going to take a bit of a chronological journey up the Inside Passage from south to north, just like I paddled it. And we're going to use those ports of call as skipping stones to work our way north. I'm just going to include a few highlights of each leg and a map of each leg, just to kind of keep us oriented, and hopefully I won't lose anybody along the way. And this red squiggly line that should be coming in right there, that represents the route that I paddled in 2010. So you can see where the routes paralleled each other in places, and other places they were markedly different. So I started on the west side of San Juan Island, like I mentioned, and first crossing right off the bat, Harrow Strait. That was a nice warm up. It was only like 2.5, 3 miles. So that was a warm up for some of the much bigger crossings that I would have further north. I made a beeline to Sydney on Vancouver Island to check in with Canadian Customs. And then I spent the next 9 days working my way to Powell River. And so on this leg and the next leg, with few exceptions, I mostly use the BC Marine Trail campsites, which, as many of you know, that's a network of established trails throughout the Salish Sea and the southern reaches of the Inside Passage that are established and maintained primarily for human-powered users. And I always refer to these campsites, the BC Marine Trail campsites, as very civil. And by that, I mean, you're almost always guaranteed a flat spot to pitch your tent, a picnic table. Oftentimes there's a fire pit, a vault toilet. The beach access is usually relatively easy for kayakers. And there's often other paddlers milling about. So these are all amenities that I would miss very much in some of the rough wilderness sites further north. This photo was taken in Nanaimo, but I actually ran into these guys at that very first campsite. This is John and Terry. They're best friends. They grew up in Ketchikan together. Now they live in Seattle, and they were rowing their beautiful wooden 17-foot Whitehall rowboat from Seattle to Ketchikan. And it's about 400 pounds empty. And here they have about 200, maybe 250 pounds of gear and food and water loaded up for the next leg of their trip. And we kind of played leapfrog on and off for the first 10 days or so of our respective journeys. And whenever we shared a campsite, these guys were insistent on carrying my kayak to the water's edge. And of course, I didn't argue with them. Sometimes it could be quite a haul. I felt very much like a kept woman. But these guys they were such an inspiration to me. They're in their 70s, and they took every element of their expedition very seriously. They were very fit. They had the nutrition dialed in, the logistics, the navigation, all of it. And then on their 20th day at sea, at about the 400-mile mark for them, they were fairly close to Port Hardy. Terry began to experience, in his words, an unshakable dizziness with the slightest physical exertion. And fortunately, they had 1 or 2 bars on their cell phone, so they were able to get a hold of Terry's doctor and explain what he was feeling. And his doctor was pretty much like, dude, your trip is over. He was really concerned about a lack of blood flow getting to Terry's brain. So enter the Canadian Coast Guard, fortunately not too far away in Port Hardy. And with Terry's permission, I'm going to share with you a short excerpt of this rather dramatic rescue. Yeah, so that was pretty scary. Obviously, Terry was whisked off to the hospital in Comox, I think, and all of his test results came back not showing anything life-threatening, but it took him a really long time to recuperate. They're all set to pick up where they left off next year and resume rowing from Port Hardy and finish their expedition in Ketchikan. But, if they're very well aware that if this had occurred a little further north, once you clear Vancouver Island, with few exceptions, there is no cell service unless you're close to these communities, and getting help can be a long ways away. So, but meanwhile, I had arrived in Powell River in pretty good shape, and I was refueling my tank with beer and chips. So this brings us to leg 2. Let's see, up through Desolation Sound and the beautiful Discovery Islands, Johnstone Strait, and into Port Hardy. So this is looking north into the Discovery Islands. It's a gorgeous stretch of water. However, this area has a fair number of tidal rapids that all boaters going through there need to navigate. So for those of you who don't know what tidal rapids are, just think like saltwater river, where the rapids can last 2 or 3 miles or more, and then they'll switch directions every 6 hours or so. This white arrow here is pointing to the southern entrance of the infamous Ucolta or Uclata, I always pronounce it wrong, tidal rapid. So there's a constriction here between those islands, and so the current can really start getting some speed going, which can create some kayak eating features such as whirlpools, standing waves, and really, really strong eddy lines. This excerpt from the BC Coastal Pilot states that due to the strength of the tidal streams, navigation of Ucolta, Gillard, Dent, and Whirlpool Rapids should not be attempted other than at or near slack water. Duration of slack water at all the rapids is very brief and does not usually exceed 5 minutes. So that whole excerpt, especially the last sentence, definitely gave me pause, because my plan was to try to get through Ucolta, Gillard, and Dent in one fell swoop. So this was a bit of a nautical chess game. I guess I'm always up for a challenge. My campsite is indicated by the little black icon in the lower right corner of your screen. And there's the first rapid. There's Ucolta. It's about 5 miles to the rapid from my campsite. There's Gillard Rapid, and then there's the third rapid. It's probably another 3-ish, 4 miles to get through the first rapid through the third rapid. So my evil plan that day was to get a real early start and ride the last of the north flowing ebb current, as well as take advantage of the southerly wind that was predicted for that day. So I am up at the crack of dawn. Off I go. That tailwind did materialize. I have a sail on my kayak. Up it went. I'm going along at a pretty good clip heading toward the first rapid. And the next thing I know, I'm in the thick of it. I'm looking down at my GPS. I'm going 4 knots, 5 knots, 6 knots, 7 knots, 7.5. Just like, woohoo, you know, ride 'em cowgirl. It was a little sketchy, but it was very manageable. Now, if my timing was off, and say I didn't have that nice handy tailwind that I was experiencing, I could have peeled off to the right into Big Bay, which some boaters do. There's amenities there. You can camp there and just wait out for the next tidal cycle, which would technically be the next day. But I was committed. I hung a left, went through Gillard Rapid. And then at some point between Gillard and Dent, the current had begun to switch. But thankfully, I still had that southerly wind that was carrying me along. And I was most definitely paddling with purpose. And I realized I was very lucky because there was really no place to come ashore, definitely no place to camp. And this is taken just barely on the other side of that third rapid. And I stole this inset photo off the web to show you what it looks like when you go through at the wrong time. Not only could that capsize a kayaker and bring them all the way down to a deep, dark room of doom, I'm pretty sure it could probably capsize a 60-foot yacht. And it has a name. It's called Devil's Hole. So after all that drama, it was like paddling through a picture postcard, beautiful, calm, glassy seas, including, surprisingly, Johnstone Strait. This was not the case when I came through here in 2010. Johnstone Strait can be a really schizophrenic patch of water. I came really close to capsizing on that first expedition. But on this day, those beautifully calm waters eventually led me to the home of the one and only Stuart Marshall. Stuart, well, first and foremost, he is an artist, and he's also an extraordinary adventurer. And for decades, Stuart had combined his two passions of painting and paddling by going off on these remote solo journeys, hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers every year, year after year after year, in a hand-built kayak. And he would set up camp, paint, paddle, repeat. And in this short video here, he's showing us where how he carries his painting supplies. He's pretty soft-spoken, so you kind of have to either turn up your volume and/or listen in.
Where the battery box was, and all my artwork would go in there, and so this is where I load all my artwork and so.
All your canvas and paint and brushes and supplies went in there.
And it's of course everything below. You can see it's below water line, so it's very stable, eh? Like you can jump overboard and get back in without thinking about it.
So I think you're getting a sense of how big of a vessel we're talking about here. And Stuart insisted that I climb down in the cockpit. And it was pretty hysterical because I could roll over on my belly and do push-ups. I could lay on my back and do sit-ups, lie on either side. And he built it this spacious so that he could sleep in it because he said he'd had one too many bad bear encounters. He definitely built this craft for strength. Weighs 400 pounds empty. It's 22 feet long by 3 feet wide. He made it out of cedar, and it's all held together with a black enamel epoxy. And he customized it with running lights, solar panels, and sailing cleats galore. And he named the boat Ahti, which in Finnish mythology means the god of water. So I stayed with Stuart and his wife, Gail. They live in Santula, by the way, on Malcolm Island, for those of you who know this area. I stayed with them for 2 wonderful nights. And the day that I left their home would be the day that I would arrive in Port Hardy. To get there, I had to paddle 24 nautical miles and just skirt the southern fringes of Queen Charlotte Strait. So as you can see here, it's a little bit of a lumpy day. So I was very thankful that I was only kind of hugging the shoreline and not crossing the Queen's Pond, as the locals call it. And when I got to Port Hardy, I spent a few days, I think actually 3 days, resting and resupplying there. This leg from Port Hardy to Bella Bella, as you can see by that green line that represents the route, well, it's pretty straightforward. It's very clean. There's no campsites, no busyness going on. And that's because when I was planning this trip, I realized that I didn't have an infinite amount of time to pull this trip off. And if I really wanted to focus on my goals of collaborating with Pacific Wild and, following in Audrey's paddle strokes, I needed to create some wiggle room. And so I've actually paddled this particular stretch 3 times in the past. And I decided that this time I was going to experience it high and dry on the deck of BC Ferry's Northern Expedition. So cruising along at, 20, 22 knots, just taking in the scenery and not feeling an ounce of guilt. It's a pretty good thing, actually, that I arrived in Bella Bella nice and refreshed and rested, because this next leg would end up being my longest and most challenging leg. The red line coming in there shows the more traditional inside passage route that most boaters take, and that's the route that I took in 2010. They both definitely have their own sets of challenges, for sure. This leg started off really slow because of some pretty breezy conditions out in the main channels, as indicated by my wind and weather apps. All that red you're seeing there means to stay the heck off the water. I had a pretty good place to hole up and wait the gale out. Pacific Wild gave me permission to stay at their boat dock, which is just a few miles from where the ferry dropped me off in Bella Bella. No one was around at the time, so I had the whole place to myself. And I know it looks nice and calm and peaceful here, but trust me, it was absolutely raging out in Seaforth Channel. And then the rains came.
Happy World Oceans Day. There are gale force winds outside of the harbor, and as you can see, it's pouring rain.
Yeah, it was an absolute deluge. I was so thankful to have a roof over my head for the 2 days that I was waiting that out. And then the rainbow came. It spilled over onto the small community of Bella Bella, which is the home of the Holtzik Native Band. And that was my sign that it was time to get this party started again. So the camping, with few exceptions, was pretty phenomenal on this leg, but the trade-off was navigating the oftentimes challenging water to get to them. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "Do one thing every day that scares you." And I think I was pretty much living up to her aspirations nearly every single day on this leg. As you can see, there's pretty big chunks of this route that are exposed to the Pacific Ocean. And then the other sections have some really strong currents going through them. And even when Mother Nature felt somewhat cooperative, I felt like I was always holding my breath and just waiting for her to drop the other shoe. There's a lot of adrenaline, a lot of stress during these 10, 12 days, whatever it took me to transit this area. But the pay dirt was a place called Campania Island. It's about 18 miles long, and my route took me along its entire western shoreline. Miles and miles and miles of these beautiful white sandy beaches that you see here. And I, for one, am so thankful that this place is so remote and so difficult to get to. And what looks like tropical water there is actually like 50 degrees, because otherwise I fear that it would just be stuffed with resort hotels. I came ashore at this one beach where I was intending to camp, and much to my surprise, there was this couple was already set up there. This is Jolene and Nicholas. Nicholas is from Quebec. She is a prairie girl, in her words, from Manitoba, and they're professional photographers. And they were on a mission to photograph the elusive sea wolves that frequent these beaches. And so they invited me to hang out with them around their campfire. I stayed there for a couple of evenings, and they had wine, I had chocolate. So it was a match made in heaven. And it's also nice to occasionally have another human figure in your photos, which is kind of hard to do when you travel solo. So these guys were really driven to, get some glimpses of those sea wolves. There were tracks everywhere. The tide would come in and erase them, and then the next morning they would be back again. So we all followed the tracks for miles and miles, and they had a wildlife blind that they set up and spent a lot of time in, and they just very patiently waited. And then my last morning there, she presented herself to Nicholas. He captured this image that he shared with me around the campfire my last night there. And in Nicholas's words, he says that the coast is all about catching the moment. And he certainly caught that moment. He actually saw her on several occasions. I never did see any of the wolves there, but the moment that I caught was this phenomenal sunset. And I wrote in my journal the morning that I left from there. I wrote, soon I will push off from this beach, refreshed and changed. I'll miss the birds chirping, the ravens cawing, the wolf's presence, the silence. But there will be many other special beaches on this journey, just not the next one. I literally went from paradise to the pits, as in Pitt Island, which is 55 miles of solid rock. I mean, the inlets, the bays, the shoreline, all of it, just solid rock, no place to come ashore for miles and miles. 27 nautical miles into this day, I finally spot a tiny patch of beach that I can at least get out of the kayak. I know that that patch of gravel is going to be underwater with the high tide later that night. But what you're not seeing at the top of that boulder field there is a dislodged dock or some sort of a wooden platform that sat teetering on those boulders at about a 10, 12 degree angle. And I walked all around it, all the while just battling horrific bugs. And I'm thinking, I got to make this work. I really didn't have any other options. I didn't have any gas left in the tank to continue north. And looking at the rack line from the night before, I was pretty confident that that little platform was not going to be dislodged and cast us out to sea. So I made it work. And if you listen closely to this next video, you can hear my little raft creaking and groaning. Yeah, definitely not the best night's sleep I've ever had. It's kind of problematic to sleep when you can hear water gurgling underneath your tent. I never did get cast out to sea. The water never touched the tent, but it did, as you could see from the video, it went right underneath it. About 3 o'clock in the morning, it started to recede, and then I could go back into the tent and get a few hours of sleep. Packed up, got the heck out of there. And my next campsite, ironically, was a very happy campsite on a place called Anger Island. So now I'm about halfway through the journey. And when I kissed this guy goodbye on the very first day of the trip, we didn't think we'd see each other for another 3 months, but this trip was full of surprises. One of which was my partner being able to get a last-minute flight into Prince Rupert. And we had about 48 hours together, which of course just went super fast. And next thing I know, he is seeing me off at the dock in Prince Rupert, and he is catching a flight back to Seattle. So this next leg, it's the next stop, Alaska. So that arrow there is pointing to the border between British Columbia and Alaska, which I would be transiting, if all went as planned, on the 3rd day of this leg. So this was a relatively short leg with a mix of weather and wilderness drama. Started off magical enough, progressed to somewhat ominous, Here I'm just beginning my approximately 5-mile crossing of Portland Inlet. So Alaskan waters are just on the other side of that. I am so close. And then on my 45th day at sea, I bobbed on that imaginary border. I spun my boat around and I thanked British Columbia for giving me such a good run. And I said goodbye to that massive fog bank. And what was supposed to be my first campsite in Alaska ended up being my first bear encounter. So I'd come ashore on this small island, and I fully unpacked the boat, brought all the gear up, brought the kayak up, which was quite a process because the tide was way out. And I tethered the kayak to a large log, still relatively early in the day. So I made myself a sandwich. I'm sitting on the log, sandwich in one hand, my phone is in the other. And all of a sudden, I hear this galloping noise. And it took my brain a few seconds to register what was happening. It's like I half expected to see a couple of ponies come galloping out of the forest. And what came galloping out of the forest was a mama grizzly bear and her cub. So this is a coastal brown bear, which is a subspecies of the grizzly bear. They're just quite a bit bigger. And so they came to a screeching halt about 50 feet in front of me. So I have food on my lap. My bear spray is in the kayak behind me, behind that log, not a very convenient place. I jump up like a mad woman. The sandwich goes into the sand. I'm screaming and yelling and waving my arms, trying to shoo them back in the forest. So they do a 180 and they go back into the woods, or heading that direction where they came out. But then like 45 seconds later, they do a total 180 and they come right back toward me. They weren't necessarily Mama Bear wasn't being aggressive, but I think they just wanted past me on the beach, but I wasn't having anything to do with it. So I jump up again and I'm screaming and yelling and acting like a mad woman. And she circles back around and heads back into the woods. So I had my phone in my hand, right? So I was fairly confident that they weren't going to come back this time. And I thought, well, I might as well document my own death. And I went to take a photo. And I didn't realize, however, that it was actually on video mode. So I'm going to share just the first few seconds of what transpired here.
Go! Go!
And I just cut it right there because after this, it's just a whole bunch of F-bombs on my part. And now the camera goes black and I'm scrambling in the hatches, trying to find the bear spray. But what I did do here is I took a couple of freeze frames of the video I want to show you. So right here, they're going back into the woods and there's the baby bear looking over mama's shoulder. And she's just like, stick with me, Brutus, we got this. And then this very next frame, she takes one more step and she just very deliberately pivots her head and she just looks right at me as if to say, any other day, lady, any other day. And then they were gone. And then I was gone. I packed that boat up in record time. I was literally running with the kayak, bear spray in hand now. I learned my lesson, running with the gear, packing the boat, and I got the heck out of there. I paddled back down this channel that had come up earlier that day and asked permission from some of the nearby fishermen if I could camp on their floating platform. So life was good until it wasn't. The next day, I headed out. Right here, I am just about to go around a prominent headland known as Cape Fox. And once I go around that rock outcropping there, I am pretty much exposed to the brunt of the Pacific. I'm entering an area known as Dixon Entrance, which is referred to as the punching bag of the Pacific Ocean. And I found out why that day. I ended up getting caught in some pretty big seas, and I would not take another photo for another 18 miles. I spent the next 3.5 hours pretty much just struggling to stay upright. So this was definitely the most challenging, difficult day of the entire trip. And I'm pretty sure that it was probably the scariest, most challenging time for me in a kayak ever. And I literally kissed the ground when I surfed into the protection of this beautiful archipelago of islands called the DeLong Islands. Set up camp here, caught my breath. And then I spent the next few days immensely enjoying the calm waters on my way to Ketchikan. This is the view from where I was staying, just south, a couple miles south of Ketchikan in Tongass Narrows. This is the home of my friend, Michelle Masden. She owns Island Wings Air Service in Ketchikan, and she's owned it for 33 years. And she was one of Audrey's all-time favorite bush pilots. So Audrey had hired her to drop her off with her kayak and all of her gear at these remote locations in Southeast Alaska and pick her up, 2.5 months later. So it started off as a business thing, and then it evolved into this wonderful, amazing friendship. And my research into Audrey's past led me to Michelle. And when I was interviewing her, she just insisted that I stay with her on my way through. And she also insisted that I go up in her float plane with her for a 2.5-hour flight over Misty Fjords National Monument. And I've got just a couple of images from that experience. It's just drop dead gorgeous. And we landed briefly at a small mountain lake in Misty Fjords called Lake Manzoni. And where Michelle and I are standing right here is pretty much the exact same location that she and Audrey are standing at. This photo was taken in the early 2000s. So we're estimating Audrey is in her early 80s here. And same thing with this photo. The rock that I'm standing on is pretty much the same area that Audrey was standing at. So this was definitely a highlight of that leg, if not the entire trip. All right, so leg 6, Ketchikan to port protection. So here I've got another big crossing. I'll talk about that in a minute. Go back into a deep bay where I'm going to grab a land shuttle, as indicated by that purple line there, across Prince of Wales Island from Hollis to Craig, and then work my way up the western shoreline of Prince of Wales, which is the 3rd largest island, I believe, in the US. So my first campsite after I left Michelle's place, I enjoyed a wonderful smoked salmon dinner, compliments of Michelle. And I sat there and contemplated my 10-mile crossing coming up the next day of Clarence Strait. And I think I had 4 or 5 10 to 12-mile crossings on this expedition. And they always weighed heavily on my mind and my heart as that day approached. Crossings can be really dangerous. We're muddling along at 3-4 knots, and a lot can go wrong in 3 to 4 hours of open water. They're usually prone to strong currents and big winds, not to mention the insane amount of shipping traffic. Michelle took this photo, obviously, from her float plane the day that I crossed. So I did pick a good day when I crossed from there to there. And then I paddled back into this bay, and much to my surprise, the next morning, Michelle did a flyover, and she took this picture of my campsite. It's pointing to my little tiny green tent right there. And she flew over pretty low a couple of times and waggled her wings. And I'm like, hey, Michelle, it's really good to see you again. So that was definitely another highlight. And here I am coming into Hollis, and I'm really stoked here because I am recreating what Audrey did in catching a land shuttle across the island. With one exception, Audrey simply deflated her inflatable kayak and rolled it up and stuck it under her armpit and packed up some of her gear bags and stuck out her thumb and hitchhiked. But I, on the other hand, had pre-planned a shuttle with a woman who ran an expedition outfitting business, and she picked me up with her van and trailer and transported me over to the other side. It was about a 20-mile drive is all. And she deposited me on the other side, helped me launch the next day. And this is a beautiful area known as Tonawik Narrows. And this area was also one of Audrey's favorites. And in her book, Paddling North, she had written I let the boat slowly turn and with a smile inhaled the whole circle of space and magnificence. And we must have had similar conditions in this area on our respective journeys, because I pretty much did the same thing. In Audrey's honor, I just let the boat drift and spin around and just closed my eyes and just inhaled the magic of it all. This area was absolutely teeming with marine life. So I played around with my GoPro a little bit. There were humpbacks everywhere on this stretch. And here I decided to take a deviation in the route. The winds had really kicked up on the outside again. And so I went through this little shortcut. It's actually a dredged channel called Dry Pass. It's really, really shallow in here. So the big boats aren't going to come through here. So I pretty much had this whole area to myself. And it was just absolutely gorgeous. I felt like I was paddling through a painting. It was so lush and verdant. It was just beautiful. And then eventually that channel popped me out on the outside of Prince of Wales Island into Sumner Strait. Again, feeling really blessed that it's so calm. This is another massive body of water. I wasn't crossing it. I was transiting it at that point. But just very thankful. It was beautifully calm. Hung her right into my final resupply town of Port Protection. Small little community, population 36. It's primarily a fishing community. There's a small lodge there that does some charters. It has a bar, a laundromat, a shower, a tiny grocery store, and a liquor store. So what else could a paddler possibly need? I hung out there for a couple of days, and then I headed off on the final leg. So this is the home stretch, folks. I could spend an entire hour just sharing some of the magic and the mayhem of this leg, but just a couple of highlights. Audrey had chosen this rather serpentine route because of its hot springs, its cabins, Forest Service cabins, and the small communities along the way. So the cabins, if you could secure one, were a godsend for obvious reasons. This one is called Big John Bay Cabin, and it was one of Audrey's favorites, and I could see why. At high tide, you could just about paddle right up to the porch, but at low tide, it drained to a marsh for about 3 miles. So this is a pretty problematic area to get in and out of. You really had to be on top of your tide tables, but at least you didn't have to worry about any unexpected visitors showing up at low tide. At least any unexpected human visitors, I should say. This is an interior shot of the cabin. I spent 2 glorious days here, during which time I reviewed the remaining trip itinerary. And I just started thumbing through some of the cabin logbooks that were left behind. And much to my delight, I stumbled on an entry by Audrey Sutherland. It's like, how cool is this? It's kind of hard to read, but there's her name, A. Sutherland, in that red oval there. She wrote this in July of '82. She wrote, I left Devil's Elbow this morning and paddled the 15 miles to this great place in 7 hours in a 9-foot yellow inflatable. A bit of a treasure hunt finding it, but a great place. And yeah, I'll have to agree with her that this was not the easiest cabin to find. But it was just made my heart just race when I came across this. Just like Audrey had highly recommended in her book, you want to be leaving Big John Bay Cabin right at the top of high tide and ride that falling tide out of the bay. And you do not want to dilly-dally. It's very shallow and it drains like really quick. So I was on my way taking my first strokes well before 5 o'clock in the morning. And here we're fast forwarding a few days. This is my last big crossing, about 12 miles over to Baranoff Island. So you're seeing the 5,000-foot peaks there on Baranoff. And I figured once my bow touched shore on the other side, I might actually pull this expedition off. because the finish line was just on the other side of those mountains. And the absolute highlight of this last leg lies deep within this cove, where at the very end is a thundering waterfall that is adjacent to a small community that is connected by a well-kept, charming boardwalk. And at the end of that boardwalk is a public bathhouse that has 3 private rooms, each that have their own deep galvanized tub, where there is hot, silky mineral water coming in off of the mountain behind it 24/7. And you can also do the about 45-minute hike up to the actual mineral pools. There are 9 of them up there, ranging in temperature from lukewarm to really, really hot. And the lowest pool, it's almost eye level with the falls there. Just an absolutely mind-blowing experience to be at that level. This was also a mind-blowing experience. I took a little side trip to Baranoff Wilderness Lodge, which was just a little bit out of the bay from where the little community was. And the fellow on the right, that's Mike Trotter, and he and his wife Sally have owned Baranoff Wilderness Lodge for, I think, going on 35 years now. And he invited me over to dinner my last night. There was a big gale blowing up Chatham, so I was actually stuck here for 3 solid days. A great place to be stormbound. He invites me over for dinner, and it was towards the end of the evening. Everybody had since gone to bed, and it's just Mike and I. And he obviously knew that I was on this solo journey, but he didn't know anything about my Audrey Sutherland quest. And we're sitting across the table from each other, and he leans into the table and he looks right at me and he goes, you know, when you first paddled in and I saw that twinkle in your eye, you reminded me of another female explorer who came through here many years ago. My mind is just racing. I didn't say anything. And Mike reaches behind him and he grabs the lodge's scrapbook. And he very carefully pulls out a photo and he hands it to me. And this is the photo that he handed to me. And I just had this big grin. And I looked at it and I said, yeah, that's Audrey Sutherland. She's my hero. I'm following in her paddle strokes, and I'm going to hopefully write a book about her. And of course, his jaw dropped down to the table and we had an amazing conversation. That's Mike on the left, where he says before he had a beer belly and gray hair. But Audrey is 76 in this photo, and she's holding up one of those fold out maps of the Inside Passage. And she's penned in all of the routes that she's paddled to date. So keep in mind here that she's only 76 and she still has another 12 years of paddling before she lays her paddle down for good. So I can only imagine how much more ink was on that map by the time it was all said and done. All right, so just wanted to reorient you guys one last time. This is the home stretch. I've just got a week to go. So the lower arrow there, that's Baranoff, Warm Springs. And there's the finish line in Sitka. So since there are no land shuttles over 5,000-foot peaks, I obviously had to continue north, hang a left through Peril Strait, and then work my way down to Sitka. So all good things must come to an end, right? Pulling out of Warm Springs Bay, the gale is gone. It's dead calm out in Chatham. Absolutely gorgeous day to be on my way. Then I hang a left into Peril Strait, really my last crux move. And I know it doesn't look very perilous here, but Peril Strait is very prone to high funneling winds and steep seas. And it's got some pretty gnarly tidal rapids on the southern portion, which definitely gave me a run for my money. But was really cool, though, that darkish round island that you see in the foreground there, I would actually camp on that. Once I left that campsite, I was officially heading south. So after well over 1,000 miles of my compass pointing mostly north, now I'm doing a 180. So it's like, wow, I might actually pull this off. This is the home stretch looking south into Sitka Sound. And this was my very last campsite, a funky little place called Scraggy Island. And coming in, about 9 o'clock at night, it was a long, cold, wet, windy, dreary day, fairly anticlimactic. But my greeting committee of one was there waiting for me. My dear friend, Chris Calvin, who lives in Sitka, was just hooting and hollering. And here he is taking a picture of me, taking a picture of him. And when my bow finally scrubbed up on shore, he had my kayak loaded, like lickety split. All of my wet, stinky gear went in the back. Wet, stinky me went in the front seat beside him. And he took me back to his family home in Sitka, where I spent the next 5 days waiting for the Alaska ferry to take me back to Bellingham. And of course, the weather got really nice. Sitka is a wonderful, wonderful community, world-class kayaking. It's fairly easy to get to. There's flights coming into Sitka pretty much every day. And then, of course, there's the Alaska ferry system, or you can paddle to it like I did. And with that, I would like to close with another one of my favorite Audrey quotes. What we most regret are not the errors that we made, but the things we didn't do. So I hope my talk has inspired you to dream big, do some of those things you still want to do, and just let your own synchronicity unfold. And I thank you guys very much for listening.